Tunisia, May 1943. The olive grove outside Tunis held 4 German tanks in various states of destruction. 3 had been demolished according to protocol, turrets blown off, engine compartments gutted. The methodical work of crews who knew the Allies were coming and had time to ensure nothing useful would be captured. The 4th tank sat intact. Colonel George Jarrett stood in front of it, not moving. He was 42 years old, wire-rimmed glasses. The specific stillness of a man looking at something he had been searching for without knowing he was searching for it. Around him, American soldiers climbed on the Tiger, photographed it, grinned with the particular expression of men who had just discovered something extraordinary. Jarrett did not grin. The tank was Tiger 712. Chassis number 250031, assigned to Schwerer Panzerabteilung 501, the unit that had achieved a kill ratio against Allied armor of 19-1. Those numbers had reached American headquarters. They had reached the tank crews in the field. They had reached the men in Washington trying to decide whether the Sherman could actually win the war it was being sent to fight. Tiger 712 sat in the grove with its engine cover removed but undamaged, probably a workshop site. The Germans had departed without verifying all demolitions. The tank had languished here, functional, waiting for someone to find it. Jarrett found it. He arranged for it to be driven to Tunis. Then he arranged for it to be partially disassembled for shipment. Then he arranged for it to be loaded onto a vessel bound for the United States. Destination: Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. What Jarrett understood, standing in that olive grove, was something the grinning soldiers around him did not yet understand. The question was not how to defeat this tank in combat. The question was what this machine revealed about the war Germany thought it was fighting. Jarrett had been collecting weapons since he was a boy in Haddonfield, New Jersey. By 1937 he had accumulated enough World War I materiel to stage what he called Little Aberdeen, an annual field day on his family's farm. Friends would gather. Jarrett would demonstrate how the Germans and Allies had operated 25 years earlier. He staged small wars with actual weapons, showed the effects of landmines on light tanks. Crowds came. Children watched. Paramount Films documented the last show in 1939. When the Army called him to active duty that year as a first lieutenant, he joined the Ordnance School at Aberdeen Proving Ground. He became curator of the Ordnance Museum. The boy who collected guns became the man who studied what guns revealed about the people who built them. In February 1942, the Army sent him to North Africa. Official assignment: orient the British to American equipment. Actual assignment: the one Jarrett gave himself: analyze every piece of Axis ordnance he could find. He walked through abandoned German positions, photographed weapons, measured ammunition, documented every technical detail with the systematic attention of a man who understood that understanding your enemy's best weapon was as important as having your own. In the late autumn of 1942, Army Ordnance created the Foreign Materiel Branch at Aberdeen. Mission: receive and analyze enemy weapons from all theatres. Jarrett was named Chief. By May 1943, when he stood in front of Tiger 712, Jarrett had spent 15 months documenting German engineering. He had seen good designs and bad designs and adequate designs. He had learned to read weapons the way some men read character, what they prioritized, what they sacrificed, what they believed would win. Tiger 712 was different, not because it was good. Jarrett had seen good German designs. This was something else. This was a weapon that revealed a philosophy, a set of assumptions about how long the war would last and what would matter when it ended. Jarrett did not know yet what those assumptions were, but he knew how to find out. He arranged for the Tiger to be shipped to Aberdeen, where men who understood machines better than he did would take it apart and tell him what it meant. 2,000 miles east, a different story was unfolding. Alfred Rubbel was 22 years old, born June 28, 1921, in Tilsit. He had volunteered for the Wehrmacht in September 1939 at age 18. Trained as a loader, then as a gunner, fought on the Eastern Front in a Panzer IV. Competent, he thought, outgunned by the Soviets, but competent. For 4 years he had submitted 9 requests for transfer to a Tiger unit. In the spring of 1943 the transfer came through. His first night with a Tiger began with an accident. He had been ordered to guard newly arrived Tigers at a rail station. The tanks sat on flat cars waiting for morning unloading. It was cold. Rubbel climbed into the driver's seat of one to get out of the wind. The ignition key was in the panel. He turned it. The engine started. The sound was different from the Panzer IV, deeper, more certain, the sound of something that did not need to justify its existence. What nobody had told Rubbel, on a Tiger, the transmission was always left in gear. When he touched the steering wheel and gave it gas, the tank lurched forward. The unloading chocks were pushed out from under the tracks. The front and rear of the tank hung over the edge of the flat car, 57 tons, balanced on the narrow center section of a railroad car. Moving slightly as the suspension settled, Rubbel sat very still. He did not touch the controls. He did not move in the seat. He understood with perfect clarity that if the tank tipped forward or backward, it would fall to the railbed 8 feet below, and there would be an investigation, and his 4 years of requests would end with a notation in his file that would follow him for the rest of his military service. He sat in the dark and waited for morning. The unloading crew found the tank hanging over the edge of the flat car at dawn. There was no investigation. The crew assumed it was a loading error. They secured the tank with winches and unloaded it without comment. Rubbel climbed out. He would write later. From this moment, I began to take the tour seriously and study it thoroughly. It was not the introduction to the finest tank in the world that he had imagined. But it was an honest one. American soldiers had been encountering Tigers since February 1943 in Tunisia. The effect was immediate. In one engagement, 8 rounds from a 75mm anti-tank gun bounced off the side armor of a single Tiger without penetrating. The Tiger's crew felt the impacts. The tank kept moving. The American gun crew watched their rounds hit and understood they were firing a weapon that could not stop what it was firing at. American headquarters began receiving reports of engagements breaking off the moment a Tiger appeared on the horizon, not because units were cowardly, because crews were doing the arithmetic. Their weapons could not penetrate the Tiger at combat ranges. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy their Shermans at ranges where the Sherman could not respond. The arithmetic was simple. The arithmetic was fatal. Military historians would later call it tigerphobia, a fear that spread through Allied armoured units far beyond what the actual numbers warranted. The entire war produced only 1,347 Tigers against tens of thousands of Shermans and T-34s. The Tiger was statistically insignificant. Psychologically, it was devastating. In one engagement in Tunisia, a single Tiger absorbed fire from multiple anti-tank guns at close range before being stopped. Not destroyed, stopped. The crew walked away. This was the machine that Rubbel was learning to operate. This was the machine that induced phobia in Allied crews. This was the machine that induced something equally dangerous in German crews. The conviction of invulnerability. Rubbel took his Tiger into combat for the first time in the summer of 1943. He watched Soviet tanks burn at distances where they could not respond. He stood in the open, without camouflage, without cover, because the armor made that possible. He would write later, the superiority of Tiger I and Tiger II in firepower and armor over all enemy tanks made us careless. We sometimes stood for hours in one place without cover or camouflage, and nothing could happen to us. The Tiger's 88mm gun could penetrate 120mm of steel at 1,000 meters. The Sherman's frontal armor was 76mm. The Tiger could kill it before it could get close enough to threaten. Against the weapons available in 1942 and 1943, the Tiger's frontal armor was effectively proof. Rubbel felt safe on a battlefield for the first time in his life. But there was something he was learning, something the training manuals did not mention and the design specifications did not address. The Tiger demanded everything, not just from its crew in combat. From its crew every moment they were responsible for it. The engine overheated. When it overheated, water entered the cylinders. The crew removed spark plugs, cleared the water, continued at reduced speed. When overheating burned the cork seals, the engine lost oil. The driver chewed soldiers' bread into paste and used it as a cylinder sealant. This worked temporarily. The interleaved road wheels were an engineering achievement. They distributed the Tiger's enormous weight better than any alternative design. They also required enormous maintenance. To replace the inner or rear wheels, the crew first had to remove the 8 outer wheels. Rubbel would write, the amount of work was enormous. The Tiger was the finest tank in the world. It was also the most demanding. Every day Rubbel listened to the engine, not casually. With the focused attention of a man who understood that sounds, it told him whether the machine was about to become a problem. A change in tone meant overheating, a different sound meant the suspension. He had learned to read the Tiger the way a sailor reads weather. In Tunisia, Jarrett supervised the loading of Tiger 7112 onto the transport vessel. The tank had been photographed, documented, partially disassembled for easier shipping. The turret remained attached, but internal components were secured for transport. The vessel departed Tunis in June 1943. Tiger 712 crossed the Atlantic, arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, and was transferred to the Foreign Materiel Branch facility. Jarrett did not supervise the initial examination himself. He had engineers for that. Men who understood the specific mechanical questions that mattered, but he was there when they opened the engine compartment. He was there when they traced the transmission line to the front of the hull. He was there when they calculated what it would take to remove the transmission for repair, and he was there when the engineer looked up from his notes and said what Jarrett had begun to suspect from the moment he saw the tank sitting intact in that olive grove. This is the finest tank in the world, and it will break your army trying to keep it running. 2 stories, one in Maryland, one on the Eastern Front. Jarrett studying the Tiger to understand what it revealed about the philosophy that built it. Rubbel operating the Tiger, learning what it demanded to keep it running. Neither man knew the other existed. But they were both learning the same thing. The Tiger was not just a weapon. It was a question Germany had answered without understanding what the question would cost. Aberdeen Proving Ground. Autumn 1943. The engineers began with the gun, the 88mm WK-36. They test-fired it against armor plates at measured distances, 1,000 meters, 1,500 meters, 2,000 meters. The penetration data confirmed what the battlefield reports had described. At 1,000 meters, the gun punched through 120 millimeters of steel. The Sherman's frontal armor was 76 millimeters. The mathematics were not complicated. Next, the optics, the Zeiss gun sight. The engineers examined the lens quality, the range-finding mechanisms, the precision of the reticle adjustments. They compared it to American tank sights. The Zeiss was better, not marginally better, substantially better, the kind of better that meant a Tiger gunner could acquire and engage targets in conditions where a Sherman gunner was still searching. Then they opened the engine compartment. The Maybach HL 230 P45 V12, 690 horsepower. The engineers documented the displacement, the cooling system, the fuel consumption. They noted the engineering sophistication, the precision machining, the materials. Then they traced the transmission line. The transmission was at the front of the hull. To understand why this mattered, you had to understand what it meant to repair a Tiger in the field. The transmission was the Tiger's most vulnerable mechanical system, not because it was poorly designed, because it carried impossible loads, 57 tons through mud and snow and combat conditions. The transmission failed regularly. When it failed, you needed to remove it. To remove the Tiger's transmission, you first had to remove the turret. The turret weighed 11 tons. Removing it required a 15-ton crane. In a forward repair depot, under combat conditions, you did not have a 15-ton crane. A Tiger with a broken transmission was not a disabled tank waiting for repair. It was a 57-ton obstacle. The engineer who documented this looked at Jarrett and said what would become the central finding of the Aberdeen report. The Tiger isn't defeated by better weapons. It's defeated by its own demands. 2,000 miles east, Rubbel was learning what those demands meant. The Eastern Front. Summer 1943, the Tiger destroyed Soviet tanks at ratios that would have seemed impossible in any other war. 5-1, 10-1, in some engagements higher. Rubbel's unit achieved kill counts that made them legends among German armored forces, but every day before combat there was maintenance. The engine overheated, not occasionally, regularly, predictably. The cooling system could not handle sustained operation in summer heat or winter cold. When the engine overheated, water entered the cylinders. The crew's solution: remove the spark plugs, crank the engine, let the water drain, replace the plugs, continue. This worked, until it didn't. Sustained overheating burned the cork seals in the engine block. When the seals burned, the engine lost oil. When the engine lost oil, it would seize. The proper solution required replacement seals. Replacement seals required supply lines functioning well enough to deliver them. Supply lines on the Eastern Front in 1943 were not functioning that well. The driver, a man whose name Rubbel never recorded, developed an improvised solution. He chewed soldiers' bread into paste and used it as a cylinder sealant. This worked temporarily. Temporarily was all they had. Rubbel would write later, with the straightforward honesty of a man describing something neither shameful nor heroic, simply necessary. This was how we kept the Tiger running. Every night after combat there was more maintenance. The interleaved road wheels. The Tiger's suspension system was an engineering achievement. The wheels overlapped in a pattern that distributed the tanks 57 tons more effectively than any competing design. On paper it was brilliant. In practice it was a nightmare. The wheels accumulated mud between the overlapping sections. In winter, the mud froze, the wheels seized. The crew spent hours with crowbars and hammers and blowtorches, breaking the ice, freeing the wheels. In summer, the mud caked and hardened like cement. Worse, when an inner wheel broke, you could not simply remove it. You first had to remove the 8 outer wheels. Each wheel weighed enough that removal required 3 men and significant time. Rubbel wrote, "The amount of work was enormous." The lateral drives, the components that transferred power from the transmission to the tracks, were what Rubbel called brittle as a raw egg. They failed under any load slightly above average. When they failed, the Tiger could not move. Every day Rubbel listened to his Tiger, not the way a driver listens to an engine to know when to shift. The way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. A change in tone meant overheating. A different sound meant suspension failure. A particular rattle meant the lateral drives were about to break. He listened because the difference between a Tiger in combat and a Tiger on the side of a road was maintenance he could provide and maintenance he could not. At Aberdeen, the engineers were reaching the same conclusion Rubbel was reaching on the Eastern Front. The Tiger's weaknesses were not mistakes. They were the inevitable consequences of its strengths. The transmission was at the front because that placement allowed for a lower fighting compartment. Lower compartment meant better center of gravity. Better center of gravity meant more stable gun platform. More stable platform meant better accuracy. Logical. But it meant the turret had to come off for repairs. The interleaved suspension distributed weight better than any alternative. The engineering was sound. The physics worked. The Tiger could traverse terrain that would bog down other tanks. Logical. But it meant the crew spent days removing wheels to access wheels. The precision machining tolerances produced components that fit together with extraordinary accuracy. Tight tolerances meant less vibration. Less vibration meant longer component life and better performance. Logical. But precision in a factory became fragility in mud and cold and combat. A component machined to tolerances measured in hundredths of a millimeter did not forgive dirt, did not forgive ice, did not forgive the specific violence of combat operations. Each design decision was defensible. Each decision was by itself correct. Together they produced a tank that was extraordinary in ideal conditions and increasingly problematic in real ones. The American engineers filed their preliminary report in November 1943. It went to Jarrett. It went to Armored Command. It went to the generals planning the invasion of Northwest Europe. The report's conclusion, in plain language, the Tiger is the finest tank in the world, and it will break your army trying to keep it running. The Americans read this report and looked at their Sherman production lines. The Shermans were not the finest tanks in the world. The Sherman's armor was thin enough that German anti-tank rounds could penetrate it from the front at combat ranges. Its standard 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at any practical distance. Its gasoline engine had earned it the nickname Ronson from German crews, after the cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan was, "Lights first time, every time." The Sherman burned. Everyone knew the Sherman burned. American tank crews knew it before they climbed in. They climbed in anyway because the mission required it, and the Sherman was what they had. By every conventional metric, firepower, armor, one-on-one survivability against a Tiger, the Sherman was inferior, and yet America kept building Shermans, kept building them in automobile factories. kept training crews in weeks instead of months, kept shipping them to Europe and North Africa and the Pacific, because the men making the decisions understood something the German engineers who built the Tiger had not been asked to consider. A tank is not a weapon. A tank is a system. The gun and armor were only one component. The other components were production, maintenance, availability, and presence. A weapon that spent more time in the repair depot than in the field was not a weapon. A weapon that required equipment unavailable at the front was, at the moment it was needed, not a weapon. The Sherman's transmission was at the rear, accessible without removing the turret, repairable with tools that were actually there. Its engine was accessible from service hatches. Its components were built to tolerances that allowed for mud, cold, and combat. German engineers who captured Shermans found them uncomfortable, cramped, inadequately armored. They were right. They were measuring the Sherman by the metrics that produced the Tiger. By those metrics, the Sherman was inferior. By the metrics that mattered in a 4-year industrial war, the Sherman was exactly right. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 17,000 Shermans. Germany produced 1,347 Tigers in the entire war. On any given day in 1944, there might be 300 operational Tigers on the Western Front, and thousands of Shermans, not because the Sherman was better, because the Sherman was there. Rubbel understood this without having read the Aberdeen report. He understood it the way a man understands arithmetic when his life depends on the answer. August 1943. His Tiger suffered an overheating failure that the bread paste could not manage. The engine required proper repair. Days out of the line. Days in a depot, waiting for parts that might arrive and might not. During those days, American factories completed 50 Shermans per day. Rubbel knew this, not the specific number, but the reality behind it. He had seen captured American equipment. He had seen the production stamps, the dates, the volume. He knew the Germans were outnumbered. What he was learning, day by day, was that the Tiger made the outnumbering worse. The Tiger destroyed 5 Shermans for every Tiger lost. Rubbel knew this. He had participated in engagements with those ratios, but Germany needed to destroy 36 Shermans to break even on production costs. The math never worked. Not in Tunisia. Not on the Eastern Front. Not in the battles yet to come. The requirements for the Tiger had been written in 1941, when Germany was winning, when the war was expected to be short, when armor-proof against any Soviet anti-tank weapon and a gun capable of destroying any Soviet tank at combat ranges seemed like the requirements that mattered. The engineers at Henschel met those requirements. The Tiger was the result. The failure was not in the engineering. The failure was in the timeline written into the requirements. The requirements assumed a short war. A war in which Germany would achieve its objectives before the Tiger's logistical demands caught up with its battlefield performance. Germany was not having a short war. In early 1943, the 6th Army had been destroyed at Stalingrad. American production capacity had been mobilizing for 18 months. The war Germany was fighting was not the war the Tiger had been designed for. Albert Speer, appointed Reich Minister of Armaments in 1942, pushed to rationalize German weapons production. Shift from the best possible weapon to the best possible weapon producible in sufficient numbers. With tanks, he faced 2 obstacles: Hitler, who believed in quality over quantity, and the army officers who had seen what the Tiger could do in combat and wanted more of them. The Tiger was a tank designed for a war that had not happened. June 1944. The Tiger met the thing it had not been designed to fight, not the Sherman, not a new Allied weapon, not any tactical innovation the specification documents of 1941 had contemplated. It met Normandy, the bocage, dense hedgerow country of the Norman interior, the opposite of the Tiger's designed combat environment. Built for open terrain and long engagement ranges, the Tiger in the bocage could not use its standoff advantage, fields no larger than a few acres. Engagement ranges measured in dozens of meters rather than hundreds. The Tiger's size became a liability. At 57 tons, too heavy for many Norman bridges, too wide for many Norman roads. The vehicle designed to dominate the open steppes of Russia was navigating lanes built for farm carts. Rubbel's unit arrived in Normandy in July 1944. He had survived the Eastern Front, learned the Tiger as thoroughly as any man could. Its sounds, its tolerances, the improvised solutions that kept it running. In Normandy, everything he had learned was insufficient, not because the Tiger had changed, because the war had changed around it. The Shermans were different here too. Not individually. A Sherman could still be penetrated by the 88 at any range the bocage permitted. But there were so many of them, for every Tiger dozens of Shermans. When a Sherman broke down, there was a replacement. When a Sherman was destroyed, there were 3 more behind it. Rubbel's battalion arrived in Normandy with its full complement. Within weeks, through combat losses and mechanical failures, it was at 60% strength, then 50%. Replacements came slowly. Parts arrived late or not at all. The repair facilities, the 15-ton cranes, the specialized workshops were farther away every week. American forces were advancing. The distance from the front to the depot was increasing. The depot itself was moving backward toward Germany, away from the fighting. Rubbel could destroy any Sherman he encountered. He encountered fewer of them each week, not because they were getting fewer, because his own strength was declining. The Tiger that could not be killed was being defeated by the war around it, by the weight limits on Norman bridges, by the 15-ton crane that was not there, by 50 Shermans per day coming off American production lines, by the math that never worked, no matter how skilled the crew or how carefully they listened to the engine. Every night in Normandy, Rubbel performed the same maintenance he had performed on the Eastern Front, checked the engine, listened for the sounds that meant failure was coming, cleaned the road wheels, inspected the lateral drives. Every night the work took longer, not because the Tiger was older, because the conditions were worse, because the parts that should have been replaced were being held together with improvisation, because the proper sealant was on a supply truck that had not arrived, and the bread paste was all they had. The Tiger was still the finest tank in the world. It was just no longer in the world it had been designed for. The Germans had built the perfect weapon for a 6-month war. The Americans had built a good enough weapon for the war that actually happened. The war lasted 4 years. Good enough won. The Aberdeen report was completed in late 1943. It did not change the Sherman. The Sherman was already in mass production, already deployed across multiple theaters, already the backbone of Allied armored forces. The decision to build the Sherman rather than a heavier, more powerful tank had been made years earlier. The production infrastructure had been built around that decision. You could not reverse it mid-war. What the report changed was understanding. Before Tiger 712 was disassembled at Aberdeen, American officers had understood the Tiger as a tactical problem, a formidable opponent in individual combat that required specific tactics. Flanking attacks, combined arms, avoiding the long-range engagements where the 88's advantages were decisive. After the Aberdeen report, American officers understood the Tiger as a strategic problem, a weapon system whose tactical superiority was being undermined continuously and irreversibly by its own design philosophy. The report's conclusions circulated through Armored Command, into planning documents, into the thinking of the generals who were deciding how to fight the campaign in northwest Europe. The conclusion that mattered most was not about the Tiger's armor or its gun. It was about its availability. A Tiger unit at 50% operational readiness was half a unit. Half a unit of Tigers could destroy a significant number of Shermans in combat. But a unit of Shermans at 90% operational readiness was still a full unit, and there were more Sherman units than Tiger units. And they were being replaced faster than they were being lost. This was the strategic mathematics the Aberdeen report had documented. Jarrett understood what the numbers meant. Not just for this battle or this campaign. For the entire war, Germany had built the perfect weapon. For the wrong war, autumn 1944, Rubbel was fighting in Germany itself. The retreat that had been inconceivable when the Tiger was designed had become the reality. His battalion was conducting defensive operations, using the Tiger's long-range firepower to delay advances that could not ultimately be stopped. The Tiger was still exceptional in individual combat. The 88 was still destroying Shermans. The armor was still proof against most of what the Allies could bring to bear. But the fuel was short. Germany by late 1944 was rationing fuel for its armored vehicles. The Tiger, with its enormous Maybach engine and its range of only 100 miles cross-country, was a particularly hungry machine to feed. The parts were unavailable. The spare tracks, the wheel assemblies, the engine components that Rubbel had always eventually managed to obtain were not there. The supply lines had collapsed, the factories were being bombed, the depots were being overrun. The Tiger that Rubbel commanded in the autumn of 1944 was the same mechanical entity as the Tiger he had first encountered on a rail platform in 1903, when he had nearly pushed it off the flat car and had sat very still and waited for morning. The machine had not changed, the war around it had. The 15-ton crane had always been a theoretical problem. In 1943, repair facilities had been close enough, often enough to manage. In late 1944 they were rarely close enough. The bread paste had always been a temporary solution. In 1943 there had been proper sealant available often enough to replace it. In late 1944 there was often only the bread paste. The wheel replacement procedure had always required hours. In 1943 the front had been stable enough to allow those hours. In late 1944 the front was rarely stable for hours. Everything that had been manageable in 1943 had become unmanageable, not because the Tiger had gotten worse, because the war had gotten longer. And the war had gotten longer because the math had never worked. And the math had never worked because 50 Shermans per day over 4 years was a number that the finest tank in the world could not overcome. The date is not recorded in Rubbel's memoirs. The location is not specified. What is documented is the texture of the decision. The Tiger's transmission failed, or the lateral drives broke, or the engine seized. The specific mechanical failure does not matter. What matters is that the failure required repair that could not be completed in the field. The 15-ton crane was not there. The depot was not reachable. The enemy was advancing faster than the repair could be completed. Rubbel made the decision that hundreds of Tiger crews were making across Germany in the final months of the war. He planted a demolition charge in the engine compartment. He ordered his crew out. He walked away from the Tiger he had kept running through 2 years of Eastern Front combat and months of Normandy defensive operations. The charge detonated. The Tiger was destroyed by its own crew, not because it had been defeated in combat, not because its armor had been penetrated or its gun disabled. Because the war had outrun the machine's ability to be maintained. 1 Tiger destroyed per day by its own crew, 50 Shermans completed per day in American factories. The finest tank in the world meeting the thing it had not been designed to fight, not the Sherman, time. 4 years of it. The war ended in May 1945. Rubbel survived. He spent time in Allied captivity before being repatriated to Germany. He came home to a country whose physical and institutional landscape had been remade by 4 years of war. He found work in tank development for the Bundeswehr, the new West German army built as part of NATO's defense structure. He brought the specific knowledge of a man who had spent years keeping the finest tank in the world running under conditions it had not been designed for. The tanks he worked on for the Bundeswehr were designed differently. Not worse. Different. Transmissions at the back. Suspension systems serviceable without disassembling half the vehicle. Engine compartments accessible from hatches rather than requiring turret removal. Tolerances that allowed for mud and cold and combat rather than assuming factory conditions. The Leopard 1, which entered service in 1965 and became the primary West German tank exported worldwide, embodied the direct lessons of the Tiger: excellent firepower and mobility, reasonable armor. Designed to be maintainable in the field, the transmission was at the back. Rubbel spent 60 years thinking about the machine he had loved, its demands, its failures. What it had meant to keep it running when everything that was supposed to support it was unavailable. He did not regret the Tiger, he simply knew what it had cost. He died in 2001. Colonel Jarrett returned to Aberdeen after the war ended. In 1946 he separated from active duty and accepted a position as civilian curator of the Ordnance Museum and chief of the Technical Library. He remained in that position until his retirement from government service in 1966. The report his engineers had produced about Tiger 712 had been incorporated into American tank development and training doctrine in ways that persisted through the Cold War and beyond. The M1 Abrams, decisive in Desert Storm in 1991, was designed with lessons that trace back in part to the systematic analysis that had begun with Tiger 712 at Aberdeen, not the firepower lessons. The maintainability lessons, the transmission at the back lessons, the design for the field, not the factory lessons. Jarrett died in 1974. He was 73 years old. He had spent more than 30 years building and preserving the collection at Aberdeen, fighting for recognition of the importance of understanding what enemy weapons revealed about enemy thinking. In 1981, he was inducted into the U.S. Army Ordnance Hall of Fame, Tiger 712s at Fort Benning, Georgia. It sits as a static exhibit, not operational. The turret's left side has been cut open to allow viewing into the interior. Weather has damaged components, but it remains, the only Tiger 1 on American soil. A machine that was found functional, studied systematically, and then preserved as evidence. Evidence of what Germany could build, evidence of what Germany could not sustain. The tank tells a story without words. About engineering excellence, about the assumptions built into that excellence, about what happens when the excellence is designed for a war that does not happen and deployed in a war that does. The Tiger was not abandoned in that olive grove outside Tunis because it was defeated in combat. It was abandoned because the crew could not destroy it properly before the Allies arrived. And so it survived to cross the Atlantic, to be disassembled at Aberdeen, to teach the Americans what it meant, not how to build a better tank, how to build a tank for the war you are actually fighting. The question that Colonel Jarrett asked in that olive grove in May 1943 has not gone away. Every defense procurement decision, every tank design specification, every choice between the best possible weapon and the best possible weapon that can be built in sufficient numbers, all variations of the same question. Do you build perfect or do you build present? Germany answered perfect. America answered present. In a 4-year industrial war, present's compounds in ways perfection cannot match. Every Sherman produced could be at a battle. Every Tiger not built because its manufacturer consumed the resources of 2 other tanks was a Tiger that was not there. The math was simple. The math was the war. Rubbel walked away from his Tiger in the autumn of 1944. He planted the demolition charge and walked away, and the charge detonated and the Tiger was destroyed. One of hundreds, perhaps thousands. The exact number is not recorded. The German military in retreat did not keep careful statistics of tanks destroyed by their own crews. But the texture of those final moments was the same for all of them. Men who had learned to love a machine, who had kept it running through conditions that should have broken it, who understood its sounds and its demands and its specific character in ways that transcended what any manual described, walking away, not because they had been defeated in combat, because the conditions that made the Tiger possible no longer existed. The genius that built the Tiger was real. The engineering was extraordinary. The men who crewed it were skilled and brave and dedicated. None of that was enough, because the Tiger had been built to answer a question Germany never quite asked clearly. How long will this war last? The Tiger was the answer to 6 months. The war lasted 4 years, and in 4 years the finest tank in the world was defeated not by a better tank, but by time and arithmetic, and the accumulated cost of being extraordinary in ways the war could not sustain. War is not a test of excellence. War is a test of sustained presence. Excellence helps. Presence decides. The Tiger destroyed more Shermans than the Sherman destroyed Tigers. The Sherman was at more battles than the Tiger. The Sherman won. This was not what the German engineers had been asked to optimize for. They were asked to build a tank that could destroy anything it encountered. They succeeded. The mistake was in the specifications. The specifications asked for excellence in individual combat, not for presence across 4 years of industrial war. When the war lasted 4 years, the specifications became a blueprint for defeat. Jarrett understood this, standing in that olive grove in Tunisia in May 1943. Rubbel understood this, planting the demolition charge in Germany in the autumn of 1944. 2 men, 2 countries, 2 philosophies, 1 question. The question we still ask: excellence or availability? The Tiger answered excellence. The Sherman answered availability. History recorded which answer won, not because it was better in every circumstance, but because it was right for the war that actually happened. The transmission needs to be at the back. The bread paste was never a solution. The finest weapon in the world is only as valuable as its ability to be there when the battle starts. The Tiger was not always there. The Sherman was. That was the difference. That was the only difference that mattered.